Today, we're diving into a really pivotal and honestly a deeply tragic chapter in American history. We're talking about the Indian Removal Act and the forced migration that would become known as the Trail of Tears. But before we get into all the policies and the politics, I think it's so important to just start here, to ground ourselves in the human cost. This quote from a survivor, it just powerfully captures what this was actually like for the people who were forced on this journey. So, how did we get here? How did this happen? Well, to understand that, you've got to go back to the early 19th century. The United States is young and it's expanding like crazy. You have land-hungry white settlers pushing south, and they're absolutely desperate for land to grow cotton. And standing in their way, the sovereign Indian nations who had lived there for generations. Now you have to understand, this removal wasn't some sudden event. It was the final step in a decades-long squeeze. For the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, the pressure was just relentless. For decades, treaties had been chipping away at their land. And a key figure in all of this? Andrew Jackson. He pretty much built his career on this, negotiating treaty after treaty, systematically clearing the path for American expansion. And this right here, this really gets at the central conflict. These 5 nations were known as the 5 civilized tribes. And why? Well, precisely because many of them had adopted Anglo-American customs. We're talking large-scale farms, Western education. The Cherokee even had their own written constitution. But here's the thing, that assimilation didn't protect them. In fact, it probably just made settlers even more jealous of the successful farms and the rich land they occupied. So let's see how all of this intense pressure was finally turned into official government policy. When Andrew Jackson, the former Indian fighter, becomes president, he makes Indian removal his #1 legislative priority. In 1830, he manages to push the Indian Removal Act through Congress. Now, a really crucial point here is that the law itself didn't actually order a forced removal, it just authorized the president to negotiate treaties. On paper, the whole thing was framed as voluntary and peaceful, with the government supposedly providing help to any tribes that agreed to move. And the official justification for it? Well, it was completely paternalistic. Jackson framed it as this benevolent act, a policy that would supposedly save Native people from the corrupting influence of whites. But the contrast between this official language and the brutal reality that was about to unfold, it's just staggering. But make no mistake that Native American nations did not just passively accept this. They resisted. They used every single tool they had at their disposal to fight for their homelands. And that resistance took a couple of different forms. Down in Florida, the Seminoles waged a fierce, decade-long war. It was armed conflict. The Cherokee, on the other hand, they chose a completely different battleground, the U.S. court system. And you know what? Their legal strategy was brilliant. They wrote a constitution, declared themselves a sovereign nation, and they took their case against Georgia's laws all the way to the Supreme Court. And they won. In 1832, the court actually ruled that Georgia's laws had no power in Cherokee territory. But President Jackson, he basically just ignored it. He flat out refused to enforce the decision. So, with the legal path completely blocked by the president himself, the government used a different tactic. They found a tiny, unauthorized group within the Cherokee Nation and got them to sign something called the Treaty of New Ichthya. The actual Cherokee leadership and over 15,000 members of the nation protested this fraudulent treaty, but the U.S. Senate ratified it by a single vote, and that illegitimate treaty became the legal justification for everything that came next. And this brings us to the tragic, brutal culmination of this entire policy. In May of 1838, using that fake treaty as their excuse, federal troops and state militias began rounding up the Cherokee people. 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children who had refused to leave were forced from their homes at bayonet point. Families were separated, given just moments to grab whatever they could, while looters followed behind them, ransacking their homes. They were herded into these crowded, filthy stockades to wait for the removal. The pure horror of what happened is captured in this account from a Georgia soldier. I mean, think about it. Here's a guy who saw the worst of the Civil War, and he said the Cherokee removal was the cruelest thing he'd ever seen. That 800-mile journey west, it became a death march. They were trapped by icebound rivers during a brutal winter. Thousands of people, completely ill-equipped for the journey, succumbed to disease, starvation, and exposure. Doctors who were there estimated that over 4,000 people died. That's a fifth of the entire Cherokee population.
The policy of Indian removal left a deep and permanent scar, completely reshaping the American continent and the lives of tens of thousands of people.
And the sheer scale of it is just staggering to look at. The Cherokees were not alone. By the 1840s, nearly 50,000 people from all 5 of these southeastern nations had been forced west. And what did that do? It opened up 25 million acres of their ancestral lands to white settlement and, crucially, to the expansion of slavery.
But this story does not end with tragedy. This is so important. It's also a story of incredible resilience. The survivors who made it to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, they immediately began to rebuild. They reconstituted their nations, they established new capitals like Tahlequah, and the small groups who managed to escape the removal, they remained in the southeast. And their descendants formed tribes like the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, who endure to this very day.
And so we're left with this question, a pretty heavy one. This history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's literally embedded in the legal and social fabric of the present. Understanding these events is absolutely essential to understanding the United States itself. And it forces us to ask a really difficult question. How does a nation reconcile a history of forced removal and broken promises with its own foundational ideals?